If I can distract the brain long enough so that it gets some sense of control and gets some sense of activity not allowing me to think about anything else, then a remarkable thing happened in the brain.
Dr. Stan Rodski, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, especially as you are an expert in the body-brain connection. And I used to have a company called the Body-Brain Performance Institute that then morphed into the Mind-Body-Brain Performance Institute. Let's talk all things body-brain connection. René Descartes, hundreds of years
That's the man,
ago,
yes.
talked about dualism as that mind and body being separate entities. And we kind of know now that he did that because Galileo was persecuted by the Catholic Church for suggesting that the universe didn't go around the sun. So I think Descartes very quickly produced his dualism paper and said, the mind is the body, the realm of religion, and the body is the realm of science.
Now, Paul, I can't believe that and I'm assuming an Irishman could bring Catholicism in so quickly into the discussion. I mean, I could have taken a bet on it and I would have made a fortune on that one immediately. Oh my goodness. So well done.
Yes, I am a self-declared recovering Catholic from Northern Ireland, right? But I think the point on this, Stan, was that kind of the Catholic Church at the time went, all right, we'll accept that. So from that point on, if you were a scientist in the West, you only talked about the body and you didn't talk about the brain/mind. Right?
No, you didn't. And you still, even in medicine up until, 1950s, 60s, even to today, you know, it's still a dubious area in the old Cartesian ways of thinking. It's still so laden with the proof. It's quite a spectacular area, really. And I just find it fascinating, you know, and it's fascinating because it's always at the heart of why. Why do these things happen? Why does someone who's depressed, clinically speaking, under a DSM current version, can't have a medical association with, you know, they can't have a disease of any sort and still be labelled that way? You know, it's quite fascinating, isn't it? So even though they say they've moved on from this area, it's still caught up in the psychiatric versus the physical medicine areas. And yet there's enough evidence coming through for us to know that it's more than just, oh, I feel better because I'm physically better. You know, physically better means I'm mentally better, or I'm mentally not better because I'm so physically, you know, there's the only connection that there is. But that's not the case. And that's where I'd like to say that it's proven, but it's not. It's still a big area of research, which is where I find myself these days, particularly in the areas of natural nutrients that we can enter into the debate, but we can get to that later.
Let's go high level. So why would there be a brain-body connection, right? Particularly if Descartes is saying they're kind of separate entities. Why would there be one?
Well, and the answer to that is inflammation. The whole process now is all around what is this role of inflammation? And the first signs of that would come with, in the original case, a lot of anecdotal. You know, it's very interesting. This person would have this injury and they would have this inflammation of a physical injury, but it would be also related to mood and then a depressive illness. And they were the first inklings that maybe this wall, between the fluids of the brain and the fluids of the body, because that's basically been the Great Wall, hasn't it?
Yes.
The Great Wall of China in there, no disrespect to the Chinese, it's the only Great Wall I know of. It has always maintained that there is no exchange in there. But we now have come to understand that that's not true. And that's been shown up by this relationship of the inflammation, when the microglia, which are, sort of the things that come in and attack these sort of damaged cytokines, which are, busily sort of having this huge war trying to bring the inflammation under control. What we find there is this relationship to the brain and to areas of the brain that are involved with emotion, which is the fascinating part here, which is highly technical and maybe not particularly suitable in this sort of environment that we're talking in, but the cingulate part of the brain, the emotional part of the brain, the amygdala that's beavering away in there. These things are, interestingly enough, so closely related to the cytokines. The whole world of that's going on in here and busily trying to control damage in the system. And that's where all of the research is currently taken. We're trying to find ways to actually understand this better. And if I can go back a little bit, my original world as a clinical neuro, and I also worked as a psychologist with executives for maybe 35 years. That's long enough, isn't it?
Yeah,
have a view. But it was very interesting in those days, and where they would present quite depressed or quite anxious, and you would test them as you would normally do. The doctors would see them as part of their physical evaluations for the insurance companies or whoever, just for a corporate health programs. You'd always get the senior executives through this particular practice in Burke Street here in Melbourne. And you'd be presented with people who, very interestingly, would have a number of factors going on. But often there was also, you've got this sense that, there had been injury as well, and whether that was physical or mental or some combination of the two. And that was the environment in which I first started thinking about this. And I first started introducing neurological techniques into the practice. I started to say, well, we were in a position to take blood, so we could do some biological things as well as saliva and urine and all the rest of it. What was more interesting was what was happening on the electrical level in the brain. Could we get some interesting evidence there? And we started, and we hooked up, or I hooked up people and watched what was going on in their brain as we were talking about things, but more importantly, as a way of how can we settle the mental inflammation? I'm using that in a sort of a descriptive way and not just a physical way, which we'll get to, but in that descriptive mental sort of a way. Could we see things that brought someone from being anxious or brought someone from being depressed, and that's really a continuum anyway, into a more regulated environment? Could we do that? And of course, that was I'm sure you covered it many times in your own world with meditation, yoga, breathing. Yes, all how could we impact those things? And that was the world in which I first, with my patients, I first started to think, well, if I actually can create a bit of a smoke environment like with bees, settle them down, maybe we could have an effect on the brain. And just by watching their EEG, which is, of course, around the heart and rate, and electroencephalogram and an electrocardiogram and the EEG, we watched the brain of these executives. And it was fascinating the first time, and this was one of the revelations which led to something that You and I crossed paths last year at another seminar. One of the revelations of that was that if I can distract the brain long enough so that it gets some sense of control and gets some sense of activity not allowing me to think about anything else, then a remarkable thing happened in the brain. Happened to the electrical system, which was also firing up or regulating the whole of the hormonal and other aspects of the brain. And that was that simple task of colouring in.
And
That was where it started.
let me take a step up a little bit, just for the benefit of our listeners, right?
Yes.
Because you talked about that, essentially the blood-brain barrier, right? So some of our listeners will not be familiar with this. So there is this barrier between the brain and the rest of the blood where there is very little stuff that actually gets into the brain, and these kind of checkpoints. Think of them like a airport security checkpoint, right? And
physical.
Yes.
Yeah, a physical one.
Yeah, and interestingly, because you were talking about depression there, and it's really interesting, isn't it, when you look at physical symptoms. So if I've got cardiovascular disease, or if I have diabetes, or any of those other diseases that we think of, there is a very clear biological signature of those things. We can do blood tests, we can actually do a clear diagnosis. But when it comes to mood disorders, there is no actual independent test of these things. And that's why, you know, the psychiatrists have created the DSM and questionnaires that are reasonably subjective, right? But what you're getting at is what is actually happening in the brain and to neurons that affects communication between neurons within the brain that can then impact on people's moods. And there's this big exploration that's going on right now. But I think what you're talking about here is this inflammation, which we now know can even come from the gut and dysbiosis in the gut, and these signals actually get through, cross the blood-brain barrier, trigger off inflammation. So talk to our listeners a little bit about that kind of process, and are we any closer to having biological traces or signatures of depression and different types of depression or anxiety or those sorts of things?
Look, I'd like to say we are closer, but the answer would be no. I mean, the best biomarkers we have are serotonin and the SSRIs, the inhibitors that most of the drugs focus on, are not focused enough that we can go, just as we do with bacteria, we can go, well, here is an agent which will attack that bacteria and we have a cure. We don't have an agent that will, in fact, move the serotonin because it got put into the system. The SSRIs, the inhibitors, they're too broad. And so the psychiatrists who dish out the medicines, of course, go through a process of trial and error, because they're trying to work out which of which of these drugs might have the impact that is required. There is an assumption, of course, quite rightly, that the brain-body barrier is one that can, in fact, be overcome because of this. But we have not found it.
And actually, I interviewed on my podcast Professor Mark Horowitz, who was one of the authors on the paper that came out last year, the year before, pretty firmly debunking the serotonin theory of depression. Their theory is that it's about chronic stress and inflammation in the brain, right? Which
correct. That's absolutely, and that's what when I was talking about these things we can do, you know, we're going, well, if maybe it's a different type of biomarker, maybe, and then in my world, I'm looking at these electrical, if you like, biomarkers, things like heart rate variation.
Yes, that what's I really want to talk about heart rate variability. So my listeners will be a little bit familiar with it. I did a podcast a few weeks ago, but
Did you? Yeah.
let's talk about that heart-brain connection. So what do we now know? What's the current state of play in our understanding of the connections between the heart and the brain? And then we can get into heart rate variability and manipulation of the vagus nerve and all of that sort of stuff. But just give us a kind of a high level overview from where you're sitting of what's the current knowledge in this space?
With the heart, the connection to the heart muscle,
Yeah.
and obviously heart rate and all of the aspects of the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system. As you said, you've talked about these things before. There is a surprisingly high level of knowledge in this area and growing. Even in my own area, if we look at the science of that, we're looking at technologies which allow us to gather that really quickly, with finger rings, ears, whatever it might be. But that whole process of the heart and the muscle around it and its connection to, in fact, preoccupying our whole physiology is huge. I don't think is there any debate about it?
I don't think there's any debate about
No.
it, really. And
No.
is that connection all mediated through the vagus nerve, or is there other forces at play?
Look, the vagus nerve has become, in my opinion, a predominant player in the discussion now. It's certainly one hell of a conduit, isn't it? In terms of the biggest nerve in the brain and the body. And I think I don't know what the answer is in terms of the other players that may yet pop up, but it was certainly a very significant one, particularly and your listeners, if they're familiar with your talks, will know that I'm now talking about the parasympathetic nervous system. I'm now talking about the system that slows us down, that gets us ready to digest, and hence the gut connection. We have a physical reaction, of course, which is there's now a whole host of products looking at all sorts of problems that people have with their gut and being able to regulate the vagal nerve as part of that process, which is the stimulating of the parasympathetic system so that the system becomes more regulated, which is linked, of course, to stress.
Just to jump in for the benefit of the listeners who may have not caught the podcast on heart rate variability, or who just need to get up to speed a little bit. So autonomic nervous system has got two parts to it. We've been talking about the parasympathetic, the rest, digest, recover. The opposing one, if you like, although it's not really opposing as we know, but there is the sympathetic nervous system, which is to do with the whole fight or flight response and just getting you ready to deal with challenges and all sorts of stuff. And the critical thing is for those two sides of the seesaw, if you like, to be in balance. And a lot of the issues now are people being in sympathetic dominance, just too stimulated from a combination of work stress, home stress, and then thinking they're relaxing, but being on social media and being stimulated, being TV, being stimulated, and not actually recovering. So I make the distinction with people between recovery and relaxation. So relaxation, recovery, the difference is relaxation sitting with your feet up with a bottle of wine watching Netflix, but that's not recovery, is it? That's not what
No, definitely not. No recovery is
the vagus nerve. So with that kind of background in mind,
you can't be overstimulated, by the way.
The parasympathetic?
Well, the sympathetic, you can't be overstimulated.
Oh, you can't be overstimulated
because it's reacting to whatever is going on, but it can go on for too long.
Yeah, and I think the thing for people to understand as well is that the stressor that activates it can be physical or psychological and can be real or imaginary, right?
Absolutely. Hence the brain's visual cortex. Its visualization can be as strong as the real world. And why in competitive sports, visualization is such a powerful technique, and right down into clinical work. where clinical visualization can help with mental disorders. They're all very powerful. You know, the brain, as you and I know, puts together a picture of the world. It's a very hard concept to sort of really, really understand. You see it and you think that's it, it's there. But what it sees is quite an interesting, again, interesting analysis. But for the sake of the exercise here, you're quite right. It will stimulate. It will also relax. It is forever in this, and like you talked about earlier, Paul, it's a war. It's like sleep and us sleep and awake. It's a war, and that war is determined by light and dark.
Yes.
Yeah, that is totally determined by light and dark. It is so ancient in us. And the war goes on. It's like that one of those cartoons where the combatants meet every day and fight it out and then go back somewhere else. The brain operates in exactly the same way, and it operates in this world, in its central nervous system, in its autonomic nervous system, in this parasympathetic and sympathetic world, where it is seeking to regulate it, just as it does with our temperature. How on earth does it keep ourselves in that temperature? It's a self-regulation process.
This homeostasis that you're referring to, there are so many homeostatic mechanisms. And really, yes, from that perspective in our discussion, we could potentially think of mood disorders as dysregulated homeostasis in the brain.
Indeed. Yeah, particularly if we accept the brain-body connection.
So let's now talk about what we can do about it and what people can do about it. And I think for the first part of this is understanding the very strong projections or connections with the vagus nerve into both the heart and the lungs. Mm-hmm. So that gives us a little bit of a clue as to what we could potentially do, and that bottom-up stimulation of the vagus nerve. Because I saw you last year using a biofeedback device and talking about biofeedback device. So tell our listeners, what is the state of play around that? Biofeedback, how does it work? The breathing, all of those sorts of things, and that activation of the vagus nerve.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think taking a higher level to it, and something I always like to explain is the brain operates in totality in a very interesting way. When we open our eyes and we get going, it's from the bottom of the brain to the top, it's from the back of the brain to the front, and it's from the right side of the brain to the left. That's its firing up directions. And if you think about everything we've been talking about, and you think about the bottom of the brain, now that's the brain stem area. That's our ancient brain. That's our old brain. That's still there within, and it's all linked to our emotions. It's linked to areas like the amygdala. When sensory information comes in, there are two pathways, as you know. One of those is the emotional pathway, and the other is the cognitive pathway. The emotional one goes first, and it started at the bottom of the brain. As soon as something started to become sensed, even imagined or real, in it goes. And then it quickly shuffles its ways through what must have been our ancient defense mechanism to avoid being killed or to kill something before we did. It's still there. It's just that this other system adds the logic of, well, we don't just walk around killing people when it suits us or decide to take things when we want it, although wonder maybe sometimes with our current world whether that's actually working anymore. But for the majority of us, it is. And this bottom to top, this is going through these emotional controllers and this interaction that's going on between the body and the brain. It's actually all about this relaxation. Should I be tense? Should I be relaxed about this? What's the memory of this? Where can I find the memory of this? I'll go to the hippocampus and I'll grab short term. I'll go to the frontal lobe and ask for some more directions and go back in there and decide, nope, we're all clear, let's move on. This is all going on in, in a second type of stuff. But my point there being that these techniques that we often focus on in here, and certainly I did when I wrote my first book on the neuroscience of mindfulness, I very much focused on all of the sensory inputs as a way of improving things, a way of actually ranging from, that when I mentioned before, the colouring in sort of process to sounds, using all sorts of sounds to get the sort of brain waves. Because the other thing, when the brain is communicating from back to front, from right to left, from bottom to top, it's doing so on brain waves. The neurons are zoom. What speed are they going at?
I think it's important here to double click on this just for our listeners who may not be familiar with brainwaves. So talk us through just briefly alpha, beta, theta, delta, and maybe even gamma if you want, but the ones that are relevant for us.
Yes. So you and I are talking right now. We're basically in beta. So that's about 12. So the wave is operating at 12 hertz. So and when we're at gamma, it's at 40 plus hertz. And when we're going to sleep, we sort of move through alpha, and lots of people have heard of alpha waves. That's about 8 to 12 hertz. And then theta, of course, is deeper, and delta is quite hypnotic. So they're, to me, the brain's high waves. They're like, if you think of gamma would be the autobahn. Get on that baby and whoosh. If the brain wanted to move something quickly, it will look for that brainwave level to move, and it will have the sort of adrenaline-filled hormone sac attached to them. Remember, each neuron carries all of these messengers along. It's going to carry the stuff that we need to really act quickly.
Because I remember reading that when you have an aha moment,
yes,
that is gamma activity. And it's basically the brain making lots of very fast connections.
Correct.
You just go,
boom. And it's making them, and if you stop for a second and say, oh, did we just go through a 40-kilometre zone and we're doing 210, it may stop for a moment. It may sort of pick that up as part of what it's going, but it's not. It's just heading around normally in the frontal lobe area, in the sort of the controller area, right across the spaghetti bolognese on top. It's sort of rushing around at the highest level in the brain. And that's why it's easiest for us to pick that up on EEGs in particular, and even some of the newer technologies with the EEGs, the encephalogram. But the point is that's why we pick up most of it on the top of the brain, and most of the stuff that's deeper in is harder for the technology, although the technologies are getting better. But my point is that in this sort of body-mind connection process, we've got this electrical world going on as well. That it's also this mechanism by which why would we have it? Because something's got to send the messengers around. But how and as we now know, 30 years, 40 years since I first sort of looked at that really closely, we now know that, things aren't just located in one part of the brain. They're now located in multiple areas of the brain. We now know the concept of cohesion, which comes up a lot in heart rate variation work, in this world of homeostasis or regulatory endeavor in the brain. It's actually working like a team. There's players everywhere. It's got more confusing as we've gone on, Paul. Yes. I mean, the older I get, the more confusing it's getting.
But at a fundamental level, Stan, I think if we talk about everyday issues and particularly around mental health and stress,
yes,
is that we're probably in lowish beta right now, which is arousal. We're interested. We're having a conversation. when we get more stressed, we get in higher beta, and then, very high beta, that's anxiety slash panic.
Yes, which is dropping cortisol like crazy into the system, which is bringing in the biomarkers, all of the proteins that are now infecting the blood vessels, literally turning, here's the crux of the mind body. This was the big discovery, wasn't it? Those proteins that built up just because we thought we were under pressure. How did a protein develop? How did that get into the brain's cellular structures, in its pathways in there? How could that have developed just because we felt stressed?
Now, when you say proteins, are you talking tau proteins and
correct
amyloid beta?
Yes.
Right? So I think for people to understand that with that chronic stress in the brain, we see an accumulation of these tau proteins, and then we see this amyloid beta. And this was the whole thing about Alzheimer's disease, right? Is they found a lot of these tangles and plaques, and they thought, well, we just need to develop drugs to get rid of that stuff, and then we'll be able to reverse neurodegenerative diseases. And it's been spectacularly unsuccessful.
Yes.
Because they haven't focused on the process, they focused on the outcome, right?
Correct. It is absolutely correct. And so, but to just home in on the critical point was those discoveries. That was when the brain-body connection was finally shown. There had to be this world in which certainly microbiodynamics were going on in here to create this physical response in the brain. And one of the leads that we have is particularly around at the moment, one of the big ones is inflammation and mood. And you're literally at the heart of all of this here. We're literally at okay, I can understand I need to, I'm in a flat and depressed mood. That may be because I have issues or social issues or physical issues or certain things going on with me, but it may also be other things. It may, in fact, be in the biology of my system. So it is a fascinating area, and also understanding the electrical component of it, understanding that we need to change. I like the metaphor of highways, sort of it's dropping off the highway into 30 or 60 kilometers, 60 kilometer zone from an autobahn. How do I change in there? Well, meditation, breathing. HRV is all about breathing. It's all about being able to control the sympathetic and parasympathetic. When you breathe in, you've got your sympathetic system going. That's the connection to the heart muscle and the oxygen supply and all the rest of that's going on there. And when you breathe out, you're activating the parasympathetic system. If you breathe out, one of the things that was amazing to me, and just before, very early in my career, I met Ainsley Mears, and he is a big proponent, psychiatrist, wonderful man, way back in the 80s. And he was all about meditation and about being able to relax. But in those days, it was more Tibetan. It was another world's medicine. But now being able to see that you can actually, the greater variation, and again, if I can actually create greater variation, that is not have an absolutely synchronized beat, I can actually create that variation. I will relax. My parasympathetic, my system will in fact engage more of the relaxing hormones. Then that is an absolute. Yeah? And I can use all sorts of systems to do it. I can use breathing, I can use sound. We've developed up sound technologies that can do these things. We're looking now, I'm working with a project over in New Zealand. I'm their chief neuroscientist over there at the moment. And we're looking at nutrients, to that the flavonoids that can actually break this barrier, so that we can actually activate the brain to be less depressed. And one of the outcomes of that research, which will be interesting for you and the listeners, is that we're also getting interesting results with concussion.
Interesting.
Very interesting results with concussion.
Because
And
there's a lot
so,
of inflammation implicated
correct,
in the damage, right?
correct.
And
And
especially if you get another hit while your brain is still inflamed, that's when most of the damage. Hence, now with concussion protocols, you need to take a couple of weeks off, right? And
you do. Yes, you absolutely have to rest to maximize recovery, Paul, which is, that's another session.
No, absolutely. But I want to double click and get really practical for people.
Yeah.
So I think we both agree that some of the most impactful and astounding research for individuals is the understanding that we can manipulate the activity of the vagus nerve.
We can.
And so we'll talk about the breath, meditation, and sound. They're the three things that I'm really keen, because I think they're things that people can just jump and go with. I was very happy to hear you talk about the breath out, right? Because there is quite a lot of research out there that any type of slow, controlled breathing is going to help with the stress response and going to help with the activation of the vagus nerve. But I have always thought, why would you, and even if we take resonant frequency breathing, which you and I both know you need a specific measuring device to be able to know exactly what yours is. But for most people, about 6 breaths a minute is going to be quite effective, right?
Sure.
And I've read research that 5 seconds in and 5 seconds out can actually clear amyloid beta. But I'm thinking, why would you do that? Why would you not breathe in for 4 and out for 6 or 3 and out for 7? Because as you rightly said, on the breath in, the sympathetic nervous system slightly upregulates, and it's on the breath out that we get the big upregulation of the parasympathetic. Am I missing something that...
No, you're not. And look, I've given up trying to rationalize all of the breathing techniques that come across my desk, or my patients in the past, or my research at the moment. The reality of it is, I don't get the connection to the research or the information or the data that tells me those things are any more than a placebo. But I do know through the research, from my own research, from when I was at that seminar last year, and I put someone up there on the stage and I hooked them up, and you can see immediately the impact of breathing out. You can immediately see the reaction of the autonomic nervous system, its para and sympathetic system seeking to regulate. And once you get your head around the fact that the breath out represents the parasympathetic system, you're creating a variation. There's no point being in there with equal amounts, because all you're doing is keeping the system in what it's caught in. That is the simplest technique to do that.
I'm glad that you reinforced that, because I've been scratching my head about why anybody would talk about anything other than a longer breath out than breath in. Now, in terms of biofeedback devices, I've got a HeartMath. Was it HeartMath that you used? And so is that the one that you would recommend for people in terms of a biofeedback device? Because it's really quite powerful, isn't it?
It's an extremely good program. I've worked with it since the late 90s.
Wow.
So, and in fact, the one I demonstrated is one of the original ones that I worked on with them. And so, because it actually demonstrates everything I'm talking about. You can't see what I showed there in now, because they've wrapped it up in all of their, IP and all the rest of it. You just
get the practitioner bits underneath the hood, right?
Yeah, I get it all. So because I had that and I'd held on to that for all these years, and that just allows me to actually break the system up, to actually see the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system in action, and also its regulatory effort. Because on the one hand, you can be high, but what's behind that is how hard you're working. You may in fact just be situational high, or you may be, high because your system just maintains you there, and that's a very different reaction. So when I
Just to clarify, when you're saying high, do you mean in terms of heart rate variability or something else?
Yeah, I mean in terms of the activation of the sympathetic
Oh,
system.
sympathetic, right. So you can either be because you are stressed in and of the moment, or that's
Yes,
just your kind of resting
yes, yes.
state.
Because otherwise the data isn't, well, how do I know?
Yeah.
So that was a very important other element that we had built into the software in the 90s. And in fact, the software was built for practitioners in those days.
That's right. Yeah.
It was built for practitioners to use with their clients and their patients. So, and then they moved to a model of something that everyone could understand or get. But having said that, it's still very good. It's good feedback. It's good feedback, particularly in this sort of ECG world of the autonomic nervous system. I think it's just brilliant and a great way to see yourself improving. We've even developed up, I've now, I mean, your listeners can't see it, but I'm holding up my phone. I've even developed up my own system now where you can put your finger over the camera and
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I've built my own. I've got prof over in Princeton. He and I have been working on that, but it's mainly he's just been checking my algorithms and all the rest of it. But I'm in a position now where not only will I be able to pick up your HRV, but I'll also be able to immediately recommend give either, sort of particularly I like sound intrusions into changing the brain waves. So we can immediately do that. That's where the science is going with this. And I mentioned that actually when I was talking, and I'm now there.
Yeah, and that's where my questions are going is on the sound. But just to kind of summarize this for people, long, slow breathing, but the breath out, particularly being longer than the breath in, is a really effective way
Yes.
to activate the parasympathetic nervous system and the relaxation response. And I talk to all my executives that ideally every half an hour, but worst case scenario every hour, get off your arse and move, get blood flow and oxygen back to your brain,
Yes.
drink some water, and then
Yes.
sit down and do a couple of minutes of that heart rate, HRV breathing with the long breath out. And it's like taking your brain out and plugging it into the wall to get a recharge.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it
No, I
brings
agree.
down stress hormones, right?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I recommend twice a day at least, where you get a note and you just literally take yourself offline for a couple of minutes and go through just 3 breaths. I mean, you don't have to do it for half an hour. You just have to break the cycle you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, just before, just a quick answer in this one, because I do want to talk about sound and we're running out of time a bit. Do you think that there are benefits of mindfulness meditation over and above breath control? And if so, what would they be?
Look, my answer to that would be yes. And the reason for that would be that I think that mindfulness, with its propensity to think in terms of the here and now and the exclusion of everything else around you and the non-judgmental processes, shifts you into the work, into many different scenarios in which you can apply it. I think the breathing I've tended to like the mindfulness sort of story because it's sort of it seems a little broader than just breathing. And people tend to think that breathing is just a sitting down thing and therefore part of some meditative process. Whereas mindfulness, as you know, if we're colouring or knitting or washing the car or gardening, if we can just be in the moment, non-judgmental, only thinking about what we're doing, these sorts of things that we no longer do, I think that's a great broader concept for me anyway.
For me, a lot of this is about attentional control and just the power of that single focused attention. I mean, one little thing that I love to do just to take a little bit of a break if I'm working is I'll just get a deck of cards out and play patience or solitaire. because you're completely it's a completely mindful activity. And it can, I think anything that where you are completely focused, but also uses your hands. And that drawing, I
Yes,
just,
and if I had you hooked up, Paul, if I had you hooked up, I would show you how your breathing came into being longer on the out, and that your HRV changed without you thinking about it.
nice. Okay. So it's a little,
That's what happened.
there we go. Boom.
See, so now for another person, that may not be the case. We've experimented with a lot of different sort of people. As long as they stop thinking about the future and the past, they start thinking about just what they're doing, not being judgmental about what they're doing, then suddenly their brain shifts into this relaxation mode. It shifts into alpha waves.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It jumps from any speedy highway we've been on down into alpha wave.
Which is ultimately what we're after, right?
Because it's the wave which is going to be the neuronal activity that's going to carry the relaxation hormones. And there are many of them.
As you pointed out earlier on, we are into this area of psychoneuroimmunology, right? It is there's electricity going on, there's messenger molecules happening, there's hormones there is just this biological orchestra that's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and it's balanced, and it's all over the brain. It was really easy 20 or 30 years ago. Well, it was that side of the brain or that, we could say, but it's just got so, the more we dig, the better the technology we get to look in there, the more complex it gets. It is unbelievably complex in there, but it's also incredibly straightforward in parts too.
Yeah, in terms of the takeouts for people.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. We just don't know always the why, and because you don't know the why, sometimes that leads to a whole different understanding as you go along. I would love to still be here in 50 years' time and see what we know then.
Yeah.
Particularly as we apply AI. It's going to expand the knowledge in these areas unbelievably. So we'll see.
Let's now talk about sound and
the
impact of sound on the brain. I years ago had a little play with binaural beats, and then just kind of forgot all about it. So talk to us about binaural beats, and is there anything else in terms of the sound and the benefits that it can actually have on our brains and shifting our states?
Yes. Well, we all understand sound, and in the sense that there's a reason there's a march beat for people going into battle. There's
military, so you're singing my song.
Isn't it? There it is, And so why would that do that? And on the other side of it, there is music which is just so emotional. There is music that is relaxing to a point. We have bursts of it, but the music itself is driven usually by environmental factors. We associate a lot of it with environmental. Some of it does overall increase or create a beat. Now, the idea of binaural beats and monos and synchronistic ones, they're all around. The idea is, of course, that if the brain waves are operating at different levels, if there is a beat that associates itself with an alpha wave, a relaxing wave, versus a beat that associates itself with, say, a faster beta gamma wave, could I trick the brain? And I say trick the brain because you're talking now about bringing in a sound beat to affect an electrical impulse going on in the brain. And the answer to that is, and it was discovered many, many years ago, we're talking ancient history, really, in some sense, because it's been around for so long, but we do understand the science of it now, is that, if I put I don't know, 450 hertz in one ear and I put 440 hertz in the other, the brain actually recognizes that there's a difference in sound level of 10. And interestingly enough, it converts that into shifting brain waves with neurons that are active at the time into the same beat, the beat to the brainwave. So you move into an alpha wave, and that's been shown. So if you can bring sound in, which is just audible, you can actually, if I'm trying to meditate, but I'm hopeless at it, I just can't do it. How many of your clients over the executives you've met have gone, oh, I try and do this meditation stuff, but and in practice, I've had people, I would say to them, look, you are so stressed, you're on these drugs, you're going to die, mate. You've got to do this. And they come back a month later. Yeah, I gave it a try for a while, but I'm not doing it. I couldn't do it. I just lost interest. Yeah. But I'm saying, but you're going to die. You've also not taking your medication, oh, I don't know. They just miss the whole, you've just got to find other avenues in a world of pills. Couldn't you just give me a pill? And I can just take it every day. I can't remember to do that either. I'll have to get my wife to tell me every day to take my cancer drugs so I don't die. But putting that aside, in the behavioral psychology part of the world, here is something where, if I actually just pop this on while I'm walking or I'm sitting there listening to something else, I'm about to go to bed, if I can actually shift my brain waves into the place where I'm now going to relax, I'm now going to stimulate the parts of the brain that will relax me. Why wouldn't you do that? Why wouldn't you do that? And I've developed up my own ones there about over 10 years. And I've got 3 for stress, 3 for sleep, and 2 for stimulation. So, in other words, change mood up, relax, and special ones for sleep as well. And what I'm linking all of that to is, because guess what? HRV also is indicative. When variation is high and we're relaxed, guess what happens with the brain, where the brain waves are? They're in alpha. Well, isn't that interesting? So now, if I can actually stimulate that brainwave, can I work the other way?
That was my question. So can we manipulate the brain waves with sound to then impact heart rate variability?
Correct. And we can.
So it's a bottom-up and a top-down process.
Correct.
That's cool. That's really cool.
It is very cool because apart from obviously our big visual cortex world, sound is our other one. Yeah, it is a major player all across the brain, and so depending on the activity. So you're trying to fall asleep, or you want to go to sleep, and you're trying to gear down, but you've just got so much going on in your head. You can actually encourage the brain to look for the brain pathways which are slower and stimulate those. And they will stimulate those so that the parasympathetic system will be operated and it will start to produce the hormones for relaxation and eventually sleep, of course. So it's a very dynamic system, but sound certainly works out.
That is very cool indeed, because I know, and I often talk when I'm doing workshops, you can use the breath to downregulate or upregulate with doing a cyclical controlled hyperventilation will release adrenaline and upregulate you.
Correct.
So you don't have to drink coffee in the afternoon. But that's pretty cool that we can use sound to both downregulate and upregulate.
Yes.
And most people would get that instinctively, right? From bit of relaxing classical music versus thrash metal, that'll have very different impacts.
But that comes with emotional controllers. So in broad sense, that's good, listening to the rain pitter patter on the roof. But eventually it bothers you, or you don't listen to it, or you don't hear it. So when you actually think in terms of vagal tone, and you think of the tones that are created in certain beats, there is a crossover with this, and you only have to just hear it. Your brain will actually adjust the brain waves as long as it can just barely hear it. Fascinating, isn't it?
That's cool. That's very
And
cool.
so you're in a world now where you're able to go, well, I can quickly measure myself, and it will tell me straight away which of those sounds to use. And not only tell me, but will deliver it to me.
Right. So you're talking about measuring yourself through heart rate variability with a finger pulse
Yes.
or
Yes.
something on your wrist. So it'll tell you your heart rate variability, and now you can go, right, based on that heart rate variability, here is the soundtrack that you need to listen to get your brain
Yes, to get yourself
and
in,
parasympathetic nervous system
yeah,
active.
to get yourself regulating correctly.
That's
Yeah.
very cool shit.
Yeah,
That's
that is,
really
yeah,
cool.
and that's exactly where I am now. So, and you won't have to think about it. It'll tell you.
Very cool.
I need to listen to this for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, or 30 minutes.
And is that now publicly available, or are you just finessing it for public?
Well, the sounds are available now at coloration.com.
Yeah.
Coloration, but soon it'll be available with the HRV as well.
All right.
So, and I use that all the time. So whether I'm working with rugby clubs or football clubs or at hot spas, all sorts of places, or in management team, things where big area, of course, premenopausal, perimenopausal, and menopausal women as well. Huge issues of hormonal regulation, and again, the ability to use not just the breathing, but be able to use that with sound. Yeah.
And is that an additive effect if there's breathing with
Yes,
sound?
because you're actually ensuring the maximum number of brain waves involved in the maximum number of brain regions that are involved in relaxing you are activated.
Okay.
Yeah. The brain just looks for the highways. It just follows, and if they're not there, it doesn't follow. It won't go there.
Dr. Stan Rodski, this has been friggin' awesome. Where can people go to find out more about you and to get any information or tools that they can use to hack their biology?
Yeah, no, go to coloration.com.
So spell that out for us. Is that
COLOURTATION.com?
cool? Coloration.com.
The books are there, the sounds are there, I've written about the science there as well. So, and they're welcome. And that's where they'll find in the future the new technology, the HRV technology connected. They'll be able to get the whole lot.
Awesome. Now, neither of us are likely to be around in 50 years to see where it's all going.
Correct.
AI, but I think it's a pretty exciting space that you are on the bleeding edge of. So just
certainly are.
Keep moving that along, mate. Keep moving.
Good on you, Paul. No, look forward to it. Thanks for a chance to talk about it.
Awesome.